They had been warned that Americans would torture, starve, and strip them of their dignity. But when Japanese prisoners arrived at Camp McCoy in 1944, their expectations were overturned, not through violence, but with hamburgers and Coca-Cola. They anticipated death, not survival. As the train doors opened in the freezing Wisconsin winter of 1944, dozens of Japanese soldiers stepped down onto the packed snow, squinting at the pale light. Their uniforms were torn, some held together with string or fabric scraps. Hunger was written on their faces, hollow cheeks, weary eyes, and cracked lips from weeks of limited rations and transport. Since their earliest days in the Imperial Army, they had learned one lesson: capture was dishonor, worse than death. They had been told the Americans would torture, starve, and humiliate them until they pleaded for mercy. Many braced themselves for immediate execution as they exited the train. Instead, what they encountered made them pause. Wooden barracks stood in rows across the snow. Guard towers, barbed wire, and a few sentries with rifles marked the perimeter. But the atmosphere was different from what they had imagined. There was structure here, even a sense of quiet routine. Trucks moved steadily through the camp roads, and smoke from the kitchens carried the scent of rich, hearty food, far more substantial than the thin soups they had endured for months. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Others stared at the ground, careful not to reveal curiosity. Commands were barked in English, clear and quick. The prisoners didn't understand most of the words, but the tone was strict, not brutal. Interpreters translated, "Line up, move forward, maintain formation." On the sidelines, Red Cross officials watched with clipboards in hand. Their presence surprised the prisoners. Back home, they had been taught that America ignored laws and treaties. Yet here were neutral observers ensuring that rules were upheld. It didn't fit the image they had been given. The intake process was routine but unexpectedly humane. The men were deloused, their lice-infested uniforms burned. Medical staff checked for fever, malnutrition, and injuries. One soldier, his arm wrapped in a dirty bandage, expected to be overlooked. Instead, an American medic carefully examined his wound. After being cleaned and redressed, the soldier sat motionless, unable to reconcile this act of care with the image of the brutal enemy he had been taught to fear. One prisoner whispered to another in disbelief, "Why would they do this? We are not their people. We mean nothing." Another shook his head. "It must be a trick, wait." Fear stayed with them. Every step felt like it might lead to the punishment they had been warned about. Yet hour by hour, something unexpected became clear: a genuine adherence to the Geneva Convention. It was a phrase they had heard before but never imagined would actually matter. Following registration, the men were marched across the yard to their assigned quarters. Snow crunched beneath their boots and the cold cut through their thin coats. The barracks, though basic, were heated with stoves, lined with bunks, and stocked with wool blankets. It wasn't home nor freedom, but it was shelter. Some prisoners sat heavily on the mattresses, pressing them with their palms as if expecting the softness to disappear. The sight of 51 BCC 785 CA2F 68081 BFA 7D919 reminded them they were still captives. Yet inside, they observed something they couldn't ignore. The camp ran efficiently, but not like a dungeon. This contrast unsettled them. They had always been told that capture meant humiliation, that surrender would strip away their honor and reduce them to animals in the enemy's eyes. But here at Camp McCoy, the first impressions were different. A guard helping a sick man stay upright, a medic wrapping bandages with care, a Red Cross representative ensuring fair ration distribution. The prisoners did not relax. Not yet. Suspicion remained in their chests like a second heartbeat. But as night fell and they lay on cots under real blankets, many couldn't help but wonder if the biggest shock wasn't captivity itself, but how little it resembled the nightmare they had imagined. For soldiers expecting cruelty, the first day at Camp McCoy marked the beginning of something they couldn't name. But the true surprise would arrive not through rules or barracks. It would appear on a tray in the mess hall, carried by the scent of meat and the hiss of unopened soda bottles. The next morning, the prisoners awoke not to blows or shouted orders, but to the sound of a bugle. The noise startled many, not because of its volume, but because it was familiar. They had heard the same call in their own camps back in Japan. For a moment, some forgot where they were, until the sound of boots and English voices brought them back. They were ordered into formation, roll called, and directed to the mess hall. Anxiety weighed heavily. Many expected withheld meals or scraps unfit for consumption. Hunger had been constant in the Pacific. Meals reduced to watery rice, sometimes barley with an occasional pickled vegetable. Meat was rare. Sugar, almost mythical. Before eating, procedures came first. The prisoners were gathered in a large room where a Red Cross representative spoke through an interpreter. He outlined their rights under the Geneva Convention. They would receive food, housing, and be allowed to write letters home. They would work, but only under specific conditions. They would not be mistreated, and would be visited regularly by neutral observers to ensure these rules were upheld. His words were met with disbelief. Some lowered their gaze in shame. Others whispered among themselves, still doubtful. One soldier muttered to a friend, "They speak of rights, but we are captives." "Why would they care?" The interpreter paused, then clarified, "These are not promises. These are rules, for you and for them. They are binding." The weight of his statement lingered in the room. Next came thorough medical examinations. Doctors pressed fingers into thin wrists, checked teeth, measured blood pressure, and weighed the prisoners. Many were severely underweight. Some American staff quietly shook their heads at the numbers, but none mocked them. A corporal handed out vitamins, small chalky tablets that confused the prisoners. Medicine for enemies felt almost insulting in its kindness. By afternoon, they were issued clean clothing, plain but practical uniforms marked with PW in large letters. These garments fit far better than their torn battlefield remnants. Some prisoners put them on hesitantly, as though each stitch meant surrendering their identity. Others welcomed the warmth, shivering less as the Wisconsin wind seeped through the barracks cracks. The guards themselves were another unexpected element. Yes, they were armed, strict, and watchful, but they didn't spit on the prisoners or strike them for moving slowly. They enforced order firmly, but without cruelty. When an elderly prisoner slipped on the icy path, a guard quickly grabbed his arm and lifted him up. No kick, no insult, just a brief nod before moving on. The moment left many unsettled. That night in the barracks, conversations were quiet and heavy. "Can you believe them?" one man asked, staring at the beams overhead. "They talk about rules as if this were some kind of arrangement. Don't they hate us?" Another replied, "They must be pretending, trying to make us speak." When the room finally fell silent, a smell drifted in from the kitchens. It was thick, rich, and fatty. Not the sour, watery soup they had known on the islands, but something substantial. Their stomachs growled involuntarily, betraying their hunger. The Americans, it seemed, didn't treat food as a weapon. For them it was simply routine, a Tuesday dinner, a Thursday lunch. But for the Japanese prisoners who had marched half dead through jungles, hidden in caves, chewing roots, and surrendered with empty stomachs and stretched skin, that smell was almost unbearable. Some buried their faces in their blankets to escape it. Others whispered that perhaps tomorrow the trick would be revealed. Maybe the food was bait. Maybe the kindness would disappear as suddenly as it appeared. Yet the next day came and the lines formed again. Trays were filled again. The routine remained steady and unchanged. The rules were real. The inspections were real. The procedures were real. And the strangest truth was slowly taking shape. America, even during war, believed in structure. But the order of rules was nothing compared to what awaited in the mess hall, where hunger and memory collided with a hamburger and a glass bottle they had never seen before. The line moved slowly, boots scraping the floor. Steam rose from trays behind the counter, carrying a scent unfamiliar to Japanese noses. It was heavy, smoky meat, but not like the dried fish or tiny portions from home. This was richer, thicker, something close to luxury. The prisoners gripped their tin trays like shields, waiting for humiliation. They expected scraps or spoiled food ladled out with mockery. Hunger made every moment drag, but fear kept them from looking too eager. Then the first soldier stepped forward. An American cook, sleeves rolled up, placed a hot patty onto a bun with a spatula. He added fried potatoes on the side, then grabbed a glass bottle covered in condensation, popped the cap, and slid it onto the tray. The red lettering on the label was strange and decorative. The Japanese soldier stared at the tray as if expecting a trick. His hand shook. "Move along," the cook said flatly. The prisoner shuffled forward, still staring. Behind him, others leaned to catch a glimpse. Whispers spread down the line. "Meat. They're giving us meat." As more trays were filled, disbelief deepened. The bun was soft, the potatoes golden, and the bottle, Coca-Cola, a guard explained curtly, fizzed as if alive. In the corner of the hall, prisoners sat at long wooden tables. They looked at the food cautiously, almost suspiciously, like men who had wandered into forbidden ground. A few men lifted the bottles to their lips. Sweetness hit first, followed by the sharp burn of carbonation in their throats. Some gagged, coughing from surprise. Others widened their eyes in disbelief. One man burst into laughter, startling those around him. Another covered his mouth and lowered his head, his shoulders trembling between laughter and tears. A thin soldier, his ribs visible even beneath his fresh uniform, raised his hamburger carefully with both hands as if it might fall apart. He sniffed it, then took a bite. Grease ran down his chin. He paused mid-chew, moving slowly as though the taste might disappear if he rushed. He lowered his head, hiding the tears welling in his eyes. A bunkmate nudged him, asking quietly if he was all right. He swallowed hard and replied, "I had forgotten the taste of fat." At another table, two prisoners spoke in low voices. "They're trying to make us weak," one argued. "They want to fatten us so we forget our cause." Or, his companion replied slowly, "Maybe they eat like this every day." That thought was harder to accept than the food itself. The mess hall filled with quiet sounds, chewing, muffled laughter, and the occasional sob quickly concealed. For men who had endured the hunger of Guadalcanal, Saipan, and the home islands during failing supply lines, this meal was more than food. It directly challenged their beliefs. One prisoner later whispered to his bunkmate that the Coca-Cola's sweetness felt like a dream turned strange, too soft to belong in war. The Americans, serving the food, noticed nothing unusual. To them it was routine. They ate the same hamburgers and fries, washed down with the same Coke, and gave it no thought. For guards and cooks, feeding prisoners was just procedure, but to the prisoners it felt as though they had entered another world. What struck them most was not the abundance, but the normality. The Americans were neither celebrating nor mocking. This wasn't a special meal meant to impress. It was simply a regular Tuesday dinner. That contrast was more powerful than any insult. These were men who had fought fiercely and had been told that America was starving, corrupt, and near collapse. Yet as prisoners they were eating better than they had as free soldiers of the empire. The shame was intense, but the relief was stronger. By the time trays were cleared and bottles stood empty on the tables, the prisoners leaned back in silence. Some folded their hands as if in prayer, while others stared blankly at the wall, struggling to absorb what had just taken place. The mess hall guards quickly called for order, directing the men back to their barracks. The prisoners filed out in silence, still dazed, whispering among themselves about the unexpected meal they had just experienced. That night, lying on their bunks under wool blankets, the memory of the Hamburger and Coca-Cola lingered. It wasn't just food, it was evidence. Evidence that their captors lived in an entirely different world. A world where sweetness was so plentiful it could be shared with prisoners, and where meat was so abundant it could be pressed into patties and distributed without hesitation. But the meal was only the beginning. As daily routines inside Camp McCoy settled in, the prisoners encountered a new challenge, living with structure, monotony, and unexpected glimpses of humanity that tested their understanding of everything they believed. The initial shock of that first meal remained, but it didn't change the reality of imprisonment. Each morning at Camp McCoy began with roll call. Boots crunched on frost-covered ground as rifles pointed from the watchtowers above. Barbed wire stretched across the horizon, a constant reminder that no matter how different this place was from their expectations, it was still a prison. Life inside the wire followed a strict rhythm. After breakfast, the prisoners were separated into work groups. Some cleared snow from the roads, others chopped wood, and some were sent under guard to assist on nearby farms. The work was steady but not harsh. Many were surprised to find they were not being worked to exhaustion. Instead, they earned small wages in camp coupons, which they could exchange at the camp canteen for toiletries, writing paper, or even candy and cigarettes. One afternoon, a Japanese prisoner held up a chocolate bar he had bought with his coupons. His hands shook as he unwrapped it. "In Japan," he murmured to a fellow inmate, "this is medicine. Here, they hand it out to soldiers like it's nothing." His companion shook his head in disbelief. The canteen itself was another revelation. Prisoners watched American soldiers walk in and out casually, chatting, buying Coke or chewing gum, laughing with the clerk. The ease of it was difficult to process. While war raged across Europe and the Pacific, Life in Wisconsin seemed untouched, as if abundance would never end. Still, the routine of camp life carried its own weight. There was no fighting, no advancing, no comrades to bury, only the repetition of daily tasks. Wake up, work, eat, sleep. With survival no longer the central focus, their minds began to drift. And with that wandering came a deeper longing. Letters became their lifeline. The camp permitted each prisoner to send 2 letters and 4 postcards per month. All were heavily censored, yet deeply valued. Men leaned over tables, pencils in hand, struggling to capture fragments of home in their writing. "I am alive" was often the only message they could fit. Some received replies, thin envelopes marked with familiar kanji. Others heard nothing. For those men, the silence grew heavier with every passing week. In the evenings, English classes were available. A few curious prisoners joined, slowly repeating words after the American instructor. Bread, table, window. Others dismissed the effort, claiming there was no point in learning the enemy's language. Still, even the skeptics listened quietly from their bunks, their ears catching the unfamiliar rhythm of the words. Occasionally, unexpected exchanges took place. At a work site, a guard once asked a prisoner, "Do you miss rice?" The interpreter translated. The prisoner let out a bitter laugh and replied in Japanese, "Rice is a memory." When the answer was translated back, the guard fell silent, perhaps sensing the weight behind those words. Not every interaction carried such understanding. Suspicion lingered. Some guards remained distant, limiting their words to commands. Inside the barracks, disagreements often broke out among the prisoners. Some held tightly to the belief that Japan would eventually prevail, that their captivity would end in victory. Others, worn down by what they had witnessed, quietly said defeat was unavoidable. One night, 2 men argued so fiercely that a guard had to step in. "You dishonor our homeland when you speak of defeat," one shouted. "And you dishonor reason by denying what's before your eyes," the other retorted. The guard silenced them, but the tension persisted. Even in the heart of America, the war continued to occupy their minds. Despite this, daily life developed its own routines. Prisoners carved small wooden toys during free time, played improvised games, or sat together sharing memories of home. The smell of the mess hall followed them constantly, but at least they received 3 meals a day, a sharp contrast to the jungle trenches and collapsing islands they had endured. This reliability alone set the camp apart from the chaos they had left behind. At night in the barracks, silence usually came quickly after lights out. Yet sometimes a voice would break the darkness. "What do you think your family is eating tonight?" No answers followed, only sighs and the rustling of blankets. Life at Camp McCoy was neither true freedom nor outright cruelty. It existed in between, a limbo where survival was assured, but meaning often felt distant. Over time, however, something unexpected began to emerge. Beneath the strict schedules and guarded fences, brief moments of connection flickered between captors and captives. These interactions slipped through the cracks of routine, moments that neither side could have imagined when the war began. It often started with the simplest bridge: language. Few Japanese prisoners spoke more than a handful of English words, and most Americans in the camp knew no Japanese. Commands were given through interpreters or gestures, but necessity forced both sides to improvise. A guard would point to a shovel and bark, "Work." A prisoner, catching the sound, would mimic it under his breath, "Waku." Others joined in, laughing softly at their awkward attempts. One evening in English class, an instructor wrote the word family on the chalkboard and asked for a volunteer to pronounce it. A prisoner stood, hesitated, then said, "Famray." The class burst into laughter, not mocking, but genuine. Even the teacher smiled, and the prisoner responded with a faint grin, his face softening for the first time in weeks. In that brief moment, the label of enemy faded, replaced by something more human, men trying to bridge a divide. Food once again became a small point of connection. On rare occasions, guards shared cigarettes or chewing gum with the prisoners during work details. The gum puzzled them. One man chewed for a few minutes, then swallowed it whole. The Americans burst into laughter, shaking their heads as they tried to explain. Soon gum turned into a simple symbol of exchange, a guard offering, a prisoner accepting with a stiff bow. Tensions were not always light. On a farm outside the camp, where a group of POWs worked clearing fields, an American farmer kept a close eye on them. His son had been killed in the Pacific, and bitterness was clear in his gaze. When one prisoner bent down to pick up a dropped tool, the farmer spat on the ground near his feet. The guard escorting the crew noticed but said nothing, only stepping closer. The cold air held the tension, unspoken but sharp. The farmer turned away, muttering, "Should have left them to starve." That incident spread quickly among the prisoners when they returned to camp. "Not all Americans follow their rules," one said grimly. His bunkmate replied, "Of course not. They're men like us. Some will hate, some will not." Inside the fences, unlikely friendships sometimes formed. A young guard named Miller, barely 20 with a soft Illinois accent, often lingered near the barracks after his shift. He carried family photographs and showed them to the prisoners gathered by the fence. They didn't understand his words, but they understood the images. A mother, a father, 2 little sisters. In return, prisoners traced shapes in the dirt, sketching their homes, villages, and wives waiting across the ocean. It wasn't a conversation in words, but in images. One evening, Miller slowly pointed to the photos and said, "Mother, father," carefully pronouncing each word. A prisoner nodded, touched his chest, and replied in Japanese, "Haha, chichi, imoto." The exchange lasted only a moment before another guard ordered Miller to leave. But a connection had been made. They had spoken across the divide, if only briefly. Still, cultural barriers ran deep, and suspicion ran deeper among the Japanese. Loyalty to the emperor was not undone by Hamburgers or Coca-Cola. Some men quietly warned others not to grow soft. They accused fellow prisoners who joined English classes of dishonoring their loyalty. In the dim light of the barracks, arguments broke out. Was survival worth adapting, or did every borrowed word, every shared laugh with a guard slowly erode their identity? One prisoner secretly wrote in his diary, "We were told Americans were animals. Yet they share their gum. They treat our wounds. Which is the lie and which is the truth?" These contradictions weighed heavily on them. For some, the guards' kindness felt humiliating, a reminder that they lived more comfortably as captives than their families did at home. For others, those same gestures revealed something they had not expected. The enemy was not without a face. One snowy night, as lights went out across the camp, a prisoner whispered to his bunkmate, "If we survive this war, what will we tell our children? That our enemy fed us, gave us blankets, and smiled at us?" His bunkmate stayed silent for a long time before quietly replying, "We will tell them the truth even if it shames us." But the truth was complicated. As the war dragged toward its bitter end, the contradictions inside Camp McCoy grew heavier. The prisoners were forced to confront what loyalty truly meant. By the winter of 1945, life inside the camp had settled into a rhythm none of them could have imagined when they first arrived by train. Hunger no longer carved their faces so sharply. Work, though exhausting, no longer broke their bodies. They wrote letters home, and some even asked guards how to spell English words. On the surface, life seemed manageable, but beneath it ran a deep and unresolved conflict. As weeks turned into months, their internal conflict deepened. How could they accept this treatment while still holding both hatred and loyalty in their hearts? Each night, arguments filled the barracks. Some insisted that this kindness was a trick, that America only appeared to treat prisoners well to break their spirit before they were sent home. One night, a man stood up and said in a harsh voice, "Don't be deceived. Our emperor expects strength, not comfort. Every hamburger you eat is a betrayal." Others, exhausted by suffering, argued back. "We're alive," one replied. "And if survival is betrayal, then what did starving to death on Saipan accomplish?" His words brought silence, followed by shame. Letters from home intensified the conflict. When a prisoner learned that his family in Osaka survived on boiled weeds and scraps of barley, he held the letter with trembling hands as the smell of roast beef drifted in from the mess hall. The gap between his life as a prisoner and his family's life under bombing raids felt unbearable. "I eat like a soldier," he whispered, "while my children starve." Food wasn't the only symbol. Warmth became another reminder. Inside heated barracks with wool blankets and sturdy boots, the men thought of their families shivering in wooden homes with windows shattered by air raids. Captivity gave them safety, but it also deepened their guilt. Some prisoners held even tighter to propaganda, repeating slogans like prayers. America was weak. hollow, ready to collapse. But the reality around them contradicted those words. Crates of Coca-Cola arrived at the camp. Cigarettes were freely available, not only to soldiers but to prisoners too. Work crews saw American farms with tractors, full barns, and endless fields. This abundance wasn't a fantasy. It was normal. When a guard overheard a prisoner commenting on the overflowing fields, he simply said, "This is only Wisconsin. You should see Illinois." The prisoner lowered his eyes, ashamed of the envy he felt. These contradictions quietly broke some men. One evening, a prisoner whispered through tears, "I believed Japan was the center of the world, but now I see we may be just one small island." His bunkmate scolded him, warning never to speak such treason again. But the thought had been spoken, and once spoken, it could not be taken back. Religion added yet another layer. Some prisoners gathered in small circles, reciting prayers to their ancestors, holding on to tradition. Others watched American chaplains lead services for their own troops. Curiosity flickered. A few even attended just to sit in the warmth of the chapel. They didn't understand the hymns, but they recognized faith. Different gods and rituals, but the same human need for hope. Perhaps the most difficult contradiction came during Red Cross inspections. Officials asked if the prisoners were treated well. Most answered yes because it was true. But afterward, back in the barracks, a wave of shame swept over them. They had admitted their enemy treated them fairly. While our own nation cannot feed us, what does that make us? No one had an answer. One snowy afternoon, a work crew was clearing a road near the camp when a group of American children appeared. They were curious and fearless, their cheeks red from the cold. One girl reached out a candy bar through the fence to a Japanese prisoner. He froze. He had faced bombs, bullets, and hunger, but the simple kindness of a child unsettled him more than any weapon. Slowly, he accepted the candy, bowed deeply, and said in broken English, "Thank you." The girl smiled and ran back to her friends. That night, he told his bunkmates that the small act of generosity affected him more than all the battles he had survived. "A child of the enemy," he whispered, "gave me food with a smile. How can I hate her?" Such moments left lasting confusion. They did not break their loyalty to the emperor, nor end the war inside their hearts, but they blurred the line between enemy and ally in ways propaganda never acknowledged. As 1945 moved forward, the prisoners sensed that the war was reaching its peak. Rumors of bombings in Tokyo and defeats in the Philippines spread through the camp. Each new report deepened the contradiction they lived with. Inside the fence they had regular meals, shelter, and rare glimpses of humanity, while their homeland burned. Yet they knew captivity, however humane, would not last forever. The question ahead was both clear and frightening. What would happen when the gates opened and they returned to a nation scarred by fire and hunger? By the summer of 1945, the world beyond Camp McCoy had transformed. Whispers became headlines carried in American newspapers that the prisoners occasionally saw through guards or Red Cross visitors. The Allies were advancing in Europe. Cities in Japan were being destroyed by waves of bombers. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki were hit, rumors spread through the camp faster than the guards could stop them. Most prisoners could not fully grasp what had happened. They knew what an atomic bomb was, but the horror in their voices revealed more than any explanation could. Then came the truth they could no longer avoid. Japan had surrendered. The announcement settled over the camp like a weight no one could lift. Some prisoners stared blankly at the ground, while others wept quietly, their shoulders trembling beneath thin blankets. For years they had held the belief that their nation could never fall, that death was preferable to surrender. Now defeat had arrived while they stood behind barbed wire, unable to fight, unable to choose their own fate. In the days that followed, the atmosphere grew strangely quiet. The guards didn't mock them. Instead, they maintained their usual routines, meals, roll calls, inspections. For many prisoners, that unchanged behavior was difficult to bear. "They treat us the same," one man whispered bitterly. "Warriors or defeated, do they not see our shame?" But preparations for repatriation had already begun. The Red Cross organized lists, transport routes, and schedules. Prisoners were given clean uniforms, medical examinations, and briefings about their journey home. They would soon cross the Pacific, not as soldiers of a victorious empire, but as survivors of a war their country had lost. Their departure was solemn. On the morning of the transfer, the prisoners left their barracks in lines, carrying small bundles of belongings. Some held wooden carvings made during idle hours. Others clutched carefully folded letters from home, marked by tears and sweat. As they passed through the gates, many looked back one final time at the camp that had confined them. It wasn't affection that made them turn, but confusion. The place where they had expected cruelty had instead provided hamburgers, Coca-Cola, blankets, and occasional glimpses of kindness. The journey home was long and heavy. On the ship, men huddled together, wondering what awaited them in Japan. Cities lay in ruins, families were scattered, and hunger was worse than before. Many feared being branded cowards and despised for surviving as prisoners. The guilt was sharp, but so was another memory they couldn't escape: the taste of their first meal at Camp McCoy. One man wrote in his worn notebook, "I thought my enemy would break me with violence. Instead, he broke me with food. I cannot forget the taste of bread, meat, and sweetness. It will follow me home like a shadow." When the prisoners finally stepped onto Japanese soil, reality hit hard. Bombed ruins spread where cities had once stood. Families greeted them with tears, relief, and at times bitterness. Some wives and children had survived on grass and tree bark. Others had not survived at all. The returning soldiers faced accusations of weakness and dishonor. But in their silence, they carried stories no one at home wanted to hear. Stories of hamburgers and Coca-Cola. Some Americans treated them according to rules rather than rage in the years that followed. A few spoke carefully about their experiences in America, admitting it made them see the enemy not as monsters, but as human beings. Others stayed silent, burying their memories beneath layers of duty and shame. Even in their silence, contradictions remained. The legacy of Camp McCoy and others like it isn't written in battles or victories, but in quiet, unsettling moments where food, kindness, and structure clashed with fear and loyalty. For the prisoners, captivity exposed something uncomfortable yet undeniable. Humanity can exist even amid war. Perhaps that is the lasting lesson. Wars end, nations rise and fall, but it's often the small decisions that endure. A guard sharing a photograph, a child offering candy, a cook sliding a hamburger across a counter. These simple actions leave marks that outlast the sound of cannons.
For those Japanese prisoners, the sweetness of Coca-Cola and the grease of a hamburger became symbols of contradiction and survival. They reminded them that even enemies can show mercy, and sometimes mercy cuts deeper than hatred, as one prisoner told his son years later. In America, I learned that kindness is harder to carry than cruelty. Cruelty you can fight, kindness you remember. War can take everything from people, but it cannot erase the impact of small human gestures, and that is a story worth remembering. If you found this meaningful, don't forget to subscribe.